Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to those on YouTube. Welcome to the third day of the symposium on digital justice in a digital age. It's the third and last day of the symposium, and there's so many things on the agenda, so I think we can just get started right away. My name is Christiane Gebauer. I am chairperson of the World Student Christian Federation, and I'm going to be your moderator for this morning or afternoon or evening. Well, let's start right away with the word of greeting coming from Philip Lee, the General Secretary of the World Association for Christian Communication, from Berlin to Berlin.
Good morning. The World Association for Christian Communication, WACC, promotes the ideal of communication for all, in which everyone has the right to be seen and heard in the public sphere in order to improve their own lives and the lives of others. WAC is committed to advancing communication rights as essential to achieving social progress at all levels. WAC's own principles affirm the belief that genuine communication creates community, strengthens participation, increases freedoms, develops cultures, and is an advocate for justice. That all seems rather obvious, yet stating the obvious does not guarantee that people and communities are equally able or have the capacity to communicate. It ignores questions of accessibility and affordability, diversity and plurality, ownership and control, representation and misrepresentation, privacy and security. In short, it ignores the many political, economic, cultural and social obstacles to full inclusion in society that impact lives and livelihoods. In particular, those of marginalized, underserved and persecuted men, women, young people and children in every country of the world. And in the context of the symposium theme, Communication for Social Justice in a Digital Age, that is what we have been talking about for the past 2 days. We heard Dr. Ellen Überschar say that the forces of democracy and public welfare must stand together in the fight to build credibility and trust in the digital media world. Digital participation is not a luxury, but a prerequisite for the development of inclusive societies. We heard Goran Buljovski say, platforms like Facebook and Google wield as much or more power than many nation states over public life, but they face no genuine accountability. We also heard from activists in India, the Philippines, Palestine, Ecuador, and Brazil, who are tirelessly working to reclaim public communication spaces that explicitly strengthen excluded voices and uphold principles of social justice and the common good. These are all signs of hope. We all agree that a framework is needed that enables, empowers, and transforms, one that sidesteps power structures and sociocultural traditions to guarantee the public voices and genuine participation of everyone. In the context of the digital age, we need to agree ethical principles and regulation for digital communications and digital platforms, applied fairly and equitably, responding to the urgent need for accessibility and affordability, and armed with functioning mechanisms at all levels for oversight and reform, a coalition of the willing could direct, monitor, and regulate the digital age in ways that benefit everyone. So I invite you to accompany WACC and our many partners worldwide on this epic journey as together we face the trials, the tribulations and triumphs of being digital. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. We will be screening an animation now. I hope you enjoy. In case you would like to comment on something that is happening today, please feel free to use the Padlet of the symposium. You can find it in the chat.
The new digital technological revolution sweeping the world may be much more radical in its consequences than the previous industrial revolutions. It is changing at high speed the way we live, work, and relate to one another. It serves well some of the needs of peoples who can no longer be physically present to each other, enabling communication and working across many boundaries. But it also raises profound and uncomfortable questions about our understanding of what it is to be human. The movement away from face-to-face communication may in some instances lead to new forms of estrangement among us. We may, in the future, find ourselves able to overcome human physical and mental limitations, such that what we mean by human today may no longer correspond to what being human will be like then. Artificial intelligence, algorithms, machine learning, biological research to create more perfect human beings, the development and use of robots, all these raise new questions about human freedom and identity. The world in which we live is one marred by many kinds of injustice and by the pain of many of its people, its creatures, and even of the earth itself. But it is also a world that is witnessing movements of change, justice, and hope. What is our vision of a just digital future? We are one world and one humanity. How will we help to make it happen? Communication for social justice in a digital age.
This is exactly the question of today. How can we reclaim humanity? How can we set ethical standards? How can we bring justice and hope? When human rights are being not protected and the human dignity is at risk, when humans are being objectified and treated as just a sum of their data, this is the moment for international advocacy. This is the moment to claim back our rights. And this symposium is about raising awareness for these rights in the digital sphere. We have been hearing so much about hate speech, about fake news, about the right of information, about the responsibility of those having the monopole. We've been hearing about accessibility and about the difference for the privileged and the less privileged groups. Today, we will take all these insights and take a look at how our future could look and how we, as Christians, as activists, can shape that future. We will be hearing about best practice. We will be hearing panel discussions. We will be discussing together, hopefully. And we will be having a look at the manifesto. For everything that happens today, you can, of course, as always, use the interpretation service. If you click on the command bar on the bottom, you will see 4 different languages available. You can choose between English, French, Spanish, and German. Of course, you can ask questions in the chat. Please do that while listening, so the questions are tackling everything that is covered in the presentations. If you're watching us on YouTube, feel also free to interact with us. And if you would like to add additional material, please use the Padlet of the symposium. I would now like to introduce our first speaker, the General Secretary of the World Student Christian Federation, Marcelo Leites. He has been active in advocacy for many years. He has a background in social work and philosophy, is originally from Uruguay, but now based in Argentina. And he has been working as the Regional Secretary of the World Student Christian Federation region, Latin America and Caribbean for many years and is now our General Secretary. He has a very special passion and engagement for eco-justice, for example, in the WCC Climate Change Working Group and in the ACT Alliance Climate Justice Group. Welcome, Marcelo.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I think that this is a very, very productive time for me, and I'm very honored to be here with you. I think I should start, but as requested, I will speak Spanish in order to contribute not only with diversity of voice, but also with language as well. So I will speak in Spanish now. Bueno, nuevamente muchas gracias a los organizadores del simposio sobre justicia social en la era digital.
I would like to thank all the organizers of this symposium for this invitation, which is a great honor for me. This process, which has involved months of work and is undoubtedly a commitment on the part of the ecumenical movements towards actions and strategies for the future, at a time when humanity is going through abrupt dynamic changes that are hard to understand in the short term. Observing, recognizing, and acting on the basis of these changes in the context of a world that is suffering through a pandemic and at the climax of the technological revolution is almost an imperative for the ecumenical movement as a whole. This is true for both its actions from the political advocacy perspective, as well as in ethical and biblical theological reflections. As you know, the world student Christian generation is one of the oldest ecumenical organizations, a pioneer which was created for the service of youth and many movements around the world, many associated movements. What brings us here today is the desire to talk about some visions for the future on social justice in the digital age as members of the international ecumenical family. We have been listening to inspiring and fascinating discussion in the 3 last days that we have been working here. And we have discovered a whole world of complex relationships between these technologies of the digital age, media, social networks, algorithms, and big data. And of course, we have also discovered some of the consequences of this form of development on our social, economic, and political relationships, both in terms of progress and in ways that are not so positive for most people. First, I would like to start by clarifying that I am no expert on the subject, but as WSCF member, we have recently started to work on it, and it will likely be an important development for our new strategic plan. This is especially true in terms of how social action, advocacy, and youth activism have been transformed by the new ICTs. Without a doubt, the arrival of the internet 20 years ago transformed our world in every possible way. However, it was the dawn of massive digital platforms that finally achieved the radical transformation that led us to the world we live in today. To give some context, I would like to comment on some elements that we might continue discussing a bit later and bring up some ideas, which will be more like questions than definitive answers. First of all, I would like to mention the emphasis on the business model and not based on technological advancement. the business model and surveillance based on digital capitalism and accumulation, and also control and manipulation of our privacy and intimacy. Human beings are thus no longer at the center of the process as the subject or object of consumption in the way one might expect in more classical forms of capitalism. In digital capitalism, people are part of an economic or commercial flow, and our information is the product. In this age of information and digital platforms, we ourselves are the product. The refinements, updates, and improvements made to the platforms or digital services that we consume may have no other purpose than to improve the field where the product can also be refined so that the product can be sold by the large digital platforms in the most profitable way. And this is true for corporations, but also for governments, agencies, and many other spaces that are looking forward to getting our data and stocking our data. Information on absolutely everything we do passes from hand to hand through servers, which are able to think for us based on algorithms and artificial intelligence, as we have been seeing during these past 2 days. In that sense, the question would be, if we are the product, are our information, preferences, political opinions, activism, social relationships, and geolocalization in real time safe from exposure to an elite group that controls this flow of information? Indeed, they are not. As we can see, it is not just about selling us goods or a service. Algorithms are constantly learning from our preferences, and they can predict what we want to buy and who we want to vote for, or our political and ideological choices and ideas. They also have the ability to manipulate information that we receive based on interests that go far beyond the economic interest. It is about shaping our ways of thinking according to the preferences of the highest bidder. And this raises a deeply complex problem from an ethical perspective, and therefore also a theological problem. And I will take the risk of asking this question. Is free will at stake in the digital age? But the digital revolution does not only impact our personal preferences, our privacy, and individual rights. It also has an impact on the collective. For instance, it can affect the world of work and, in certain cases, the religiosity of some digital platforms. So we may not be in danger, but some people are risking their lives every day to advocate for the rights of indigenous peoples or peoples who are threatened in one way or another. So these people are constantly under surveillance. And if we are normally under surveillance, imagine what this represents for people who are risking their lives every day. Also, in some senses, the religiosity of some digital platforms led to believe that this could lead to a world where we do not have this power relationship dynamics, and we could become the entrepreneurs of our own world. we had been believed that Uberization of the economy was a collaborative alternative that represented solidarity, but this process has changed into a model that makes employment more flexible and more precarious. And I would like to speak about this in the context of the so-called fourth revolution. In this sense, we can conclude that in the digital age, the future of life choices, work, and privacy will be exposed to surveillance and hegemonic control, following the underlying logic that people who are controlled and fearful make better product consumers. It is a win-win business, and this depends on a system that determines what we want, even before we know it ourselves. A second point would be the dispute of hegemonies in the economic, religious, media, and political fields. And this is related with the debate in terms of the dispute of narratives. The fact that these platforms are not regulated has served to promote conservative narratives or neo-conservative narratives that have been incorporated into social media and beyond. One example among many is that they have managed to reopen a debate about ethical questions that were no longer up for debate. But today, these questions, such as human rights, are again at stake through social media and hegemonic media. So the intention is not to demonize technological advancement, but rather the accompanying business model. It is also part of a complex network that includes the traditional media, who are trying to position themselves in the digital market, as well as conservative and extremist groups, and the international economic lobby. These are different groups, scientists or anti-systemic groups, wrongly called like that, and they have found fertile soil to get into these narratives and be overrepresented in the public space. In this sense, appropriation of language has played an important role. Extremists are beginning to adopt and use terms and concepts that were once used by progressive and emancipation movements. 20 years ago, it was impossible to imagine, and I will try to go a bit deeper on this. As I was saying, it was impossible to imagine a young fundamentalist who called himself a rebel or a revolutionary at the same time as he shouted death to the state, or claimed that human rights are a fallacy. But today, emancipation language like this has been hijacked by many ultra-conservative libertarian movements. And these narratives must be a part again of progressive movements. The overrepresentation of these narratives on social platforms and traditional media leads to think or coin the idea of a propagation of a kind of digital fascism completely free of guilt. When these new ideas that we find on social media take the streets, the public space of our capitals through social network-driven, self-organized marches against migrants or marches that are nationalist, misogynist, or demand the death of the state, it becomes a real danger for everyone who is different. Today, rebellion appears to young people in the form of anti-vaccination, for instance, or conspiracy theories. This seems to be the new concept of a rebel in these public spaces, or even anything that is intended to common well-being, so-called communism, everything that doesn't have these over liberal ideas is considered as communism, and we can experience this in my own country or in Latin America, for instance, when speaking about the United Nations or the OMS, the WHO most recently. In that sense, this grows exponentially, and those who think differently, who do not think like them, become the enemy. And digital tools are not neutral in this sense because they respond to the people who pay for the clicks or the parties that pay to get the information of the users who have clicked. We have seen it in Brazil and in the United States. I can't imagine a humble church in the global south or in the ecumenical movement having this same kind of representation. They cannot pay for the same number of clicks or for advertising ideas related to public well-being. There are other foundations, the so-called libertarian foundations, who can do that in the global south in order to spread, sustain, and position a fundamentalist economic, political, and religious discourse. I would like to speak now a little bit about the challenges for the future to contribute to the debate. And I would say that technologies have changed the lives of many people, improving our quality of life, connecting us with each other, and in many cases, improving access to information. And it has improved quality of life in general. This is not a matter of advocating for a technological apocalypse or a great blackout, but one must consider some of the following things, given that we are pushing ethical limits to the point that they threaten the privacy of the individual and the dignity of the collective. Building a first point of debate towards the future would be thinking about counter narratives that have to be transformative. Conspirational forms of discourse, or those that are extremist or fundamentalist, are overrepresented in social media, as we were saying, and they are useful both to the traditional hegemonic media and to the real sources of power. We know historically that these have not been very transformative. Fighting against the hegemonic narratives of the new technological languages and of the new forms of extremism and fundamentalism that are jeopardizing the entire system of ethical principles, rights, and science is an imperative for the ecumenical movement. Another point to keep in mind for the present and the future is the concentration of wealth and inequalities as part of technological development of the economies and digital platforms, and recognizing the exacerbation of inequalities brought about by digital capitalism, fighting against the monopolies that create an unequal distribution of information and access to information, the concentration of digital platforms of wealth in the hands of a few people has also been aggravated by the pandemic. Another point that we should remind is just and equal translation and transition. And I would like to speak about meritocracy as the form of religion of the digital age that is expanding and positioning itself as part of the hegemonic discourse. The idea that we can all be the entrepreneur of our own self transcends the digital world, but is connected to the growth and development of startups and entrepreneurship. Discussing this system is also an ethical must, a multidisciplinary ecumenical coalition based on theological principles and advocacy should promote fair transitions in the labor market within the framework of the fourth revolution. And on another hand, it would be interesting to suggest a system that guarantees basic human rights, fighting against them, and not only for our own personal interests, but also try to be protected from surveillance, but also promoting economic and cultural access rights with an emphasis on the collective, while refusing the idea that the first arrived will be the first to regulate the empire. So to say, this idea that the pioneers of digital platforms that are self-regulating, and it is necessary to create regulation, digital regulation that is
echando todo discurso de odio. Una coalición ecuménica debe entonces promover una legislación que permita la interacción entre las personas con el derecho a la información y que respete los derechos humanos más fundamentales. Y esto no es solamente una acción profética, sino es una acción urgente ante un mundo que cambia a la velocidad de millones de clics por segundo. Por último, para finalizar, y también una de las preocupaciones, creo que para todos y para todas en este espacio, es evitar el problema de la cápsula digital y fomentar el rol del movimiento ecuménico
of the ecumenical movement to get out of this digital capsule. The church and faith-based ecumenical organizations have a great role to fulfill in the post-pandemic world, building in-person community. It is necessary that we hug again, that we share the table, that we have a new era that is not the new normal, where everybody with our faith placed in technology as a source of hope for development, but rather the idea that another world is possible, which is not normal at all if we look at our pre-pandemic ways of life. Neither the hegemonic means of communication nor the digital economic, social, and production platforms that we see occupy or should occupy the space and the role that we have as people in our relationships. We also see that everything is at our fingertips, a relationship through social networks, purchases through e-commerce, food through ordering platforms. We also have learned that we can work from home. But what are the costs for the future of young people or the so-called pandemials, or even for church life, as well as for social life? We have to avoid this digital encapsulation because this isolates us and makes us more individualistic. And it also takes us away from our social and political activism. And finally, to conclude, I think the hope that we want to promote cannot be similar to that of a world that failed to dignify the lives of the majority of people. We cannot use the same tools. It must be a transformative and fair world, one that unifies people, but does so with equality and equity. And this is relevant and very urgent in this digital age that we live in. So thank you very much for your time.
Del horario.
Thank you so much, Marcelo. I'm very optimistic that we can do something all together in the fight for unity and equity. And I would agree with you when it comes to the role of church and of the ecumenical coalition, as you called it, for claiming back our values. I would like to hand over now to Tiana Petkovic for a response. She is an Orthodox theologian coming from Serbia and who has studied at the Bosse Ecumenical Institute. Further stops in her academic journey include the University of Geneva, the Friedrich Alexander University of Erlangen-Nuremberg. It's a pleasure to have you.
So hard to say something new after so many excellent lectures and discussions, but I will try, or I will just summarize. Today's world is almost impossible to imagine without internet, social networks, electronic communication, and mobile devices. We live in a world where we are wrapped with media and colonized by technology. So much so that it is almost impossible to escape from them if we try to do so. This raises important questions about how we should live in such a world. What place does God have in the digital spaces we create and inhabit? What does a good life looks like in this world? And how do we find the wisdom to make good decisions leading to this good life of ourselves and others as we negotiate faith and live in offline and online spaces and the blurred boundaries between those places? Human technology and media are shaped by people who are part of a world affected by sin, human self-interest, and ruptured relationships between God and human beings and the wider natural world. These technologies are also produced by a God-given human creativity, which can be channeled to enhance relationships, alleviate suffering, and recognize the other as a person of worth and dignity. So what should we do? We need to be awake. And what that exactly means. Most fundamentally, being awake means recognizing that the same existing systems that promise openness and deliver convenience come with significant costs that are affecting citizens right now. And many of those costs are being borne by those least able to afford them, communities with less access to wealth or power, and those who are already marginalized. When an algorithm fails to predict the next word you want to write and to type, that's generally not a big deal. But when an algorithm, intelligent or otherwise, uses a model to decide whether you're eligible for government benefits, whether you should be allowed to board a flight, we are talking about potential violations of human rights and procedural fairness. So how we can get out of this pickle? I summarized two suggestions. First one would be to take an active role in shaping future directions. So we need to shift our mindset from being passive observers to active participants. The downside of talking about how powerful and transformational new technologies is that we forget that human beings are designing, commercializing, marketing, buying, and using this technology. So adopting a wait and see approach would be a mistake. Instead, we must recognize that institutions and organizations have the power to shape this revolution in a direction that we want. This approach means focusing on leading rather than adapting to a changing technological environment in partnership with the business community. Second approach would be to tackle the moral component of emerging technologies. So we need to appreciate that these issues cannot be solved by simply designing better algorithms or by investing in education and training, as important as all those aspects are. Because technologies are not neutral. They are shaped by our assumptions about the world, by our biases and human frailties. And the more powerful a technology is, the greater our responsibility to make sure it is consciously designed and deployed in ways that uphold our values. Unfortunately, the ethical and moral aspects of technology are often and incorrectly viewed as falling into one of two categories, either as soft, imprecise, and inessential issues, interesting only to lefty activists, a distraction in the boardroom, or as technical, regulatory, compliance-related challenges discussed in the boardroom only when a crisis has occurred. A far more useful framing of ethics in technology is a set of practical, accessible, and essential tools that can help organizations create sustainable value. A critical task here is building ethical considerations into the very early stages of creating new technologies. Commercial artificial intelligence teams are beginning to do this. So, as we move forward in an increasingly complex and advanced society, we need to remember that all of technology, from artificial moon to artificial intelligence, is to be used for the glory of God and the good of others. We must be those who engage it with intentionality, using the wisdom that our God gives freely to partner in his redemptive work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tiana. That was truly inspiring, and I hope that we will all leave that symposium and take our active role in shaping the future, and that we will claim this space. I'm now handing over to Professor Anita Klute, who's an associate professor at the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa. She's doing research in the fields of spirituality, youth work, ministry and congregational contexts, as well as religion and media. Also, she's a supervisor for postgraduate students, which, asking me, is a great way of shaping the future. It's a pleasure to have you, Anita.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? I just want to make sure. Yes. Okay, I'm sure you can hear me well. It's definitely a pleasure for me to participate in this online webinar. And just imagine if we didn't have these tools and this technology, this would not be possible. So just to say that is what technology can do. But in my response, I will respond to the keynote as I go along with a few things that I want to suggest in terms of the road ahead. I think importantly, as we're doing today, is to continuously reflect on the nature of technology. In other words, not only the end products and how we use it, but what does it really entail? What is included and embedded within this technology? Because that is the heartbeat, I suppose, of the digital age. Because it's just much more than the tools that we use. So it's not things that we can just use as we find fit. And I think that was actually also what Marcelo referred to in his speech in terms of how the reduction of human beings has come about in this technological age. So I prefer also to refer to the technological age as part of the digital age, because the two is actually the same in one aspect, but also one can actually also say that the digital age is actually an end product of technology. Why should we continue to reflect on this is because it really does affect us on a very existential level. It's not something that is outside of us, as we could also see in Marcelo's speech, that it's actually really coming under our skin. The whole thing about spying on us in several ways is actually become an enormous problem, because it's actually knowing more about ourselves than that we know about ourselves. But also on the other side, it's also forming and shaping our dreams of the future, how we orientate ourselves towards the future. And what we also need to take into account is that this effects of impact is not linear. So it's a very almost messy kind of business that we engage in when we reflect, but it's so important exactly because of this. So we can't just say technology is bad, because I think many church people in my everyday experience actually have very unbalanced views of technology. They're rather totally against it, or they see it as some kind of savior. But I think we need to assist people to come to a middle ground in how to navigate our everyday existence, and especially our spiritual lives in this technology world, because it as much as it can create community, it can also destroy community, because it can also bring different ways of taking people apart. So while it can connect, I mean, that was maybe, if you think about something like Facebook, that was, for instance, a big thing that I think, but I never thought it would be so big, I think. So what we've done then was with the tool that was given to us, or the platform, was much more. So then it becomes almost impossible to trace what happened here. So therefore, continuous reflection on a very scientific level, I think, is very important. Like we know, it can open new worlds for many, but it excludes others. So the whole ambiguousness and almost the paradox of how it impacts. The reason why we should continuously reflect like we do today is because it becomes so domesticated, meaning that we think we know. So we take it for granted. It must be there. It's part of our everyday life. And therefore, we think it's not minor what it's doing to our lives, but it's actually quite forceful in what it's doing to our lives. And therefore, one of the common beliefs about technology is that it will change life on all the different spheres for the better. Now, I think that is true on some levels. If you think about this pandemic and what technology has done to reach people, to get messages to people, to make sense of what is going on, to make sense of life, to stand in on so many levels. I mean, me being at the university, if we couldn't go online, if we couldn't provide students with gadgets like computers to continue their studies, a whole year or two would be missing in their academic careers. But technology really filled that gap. But now after a year, we're standing back and I realize, for instance, that contact, that physical contact, looking somebody in the eye is very important in education, and we are missing that. And it impacts on outcomes of the education process. So this understanding can be very simplistic, I think, and it's also misleading. Marcelo also referred to the fact that how technology and living in this digital age is actually embedded within existing structures like economy, like capitalism. He referred to how we as human beings become the product, and also other social structures. We know how in politics this plays quite a big role. There's upcoming elections in South Africa, and I think now you can see all the different things coming out on different ways trying to reach us in terms of the next election. And then institutions, also in churches. It was interesting how churches actually moved their viewpoint on technology during this pandemic. All of a sudden, they they sort of applaud it because it's the only way to hopefully save the church in staying in contact with their members. But also looking back now, they realize it's also not doing that. So it's always this ambiguousness effect. Then I also want to refer to values. Now, I'm not a systematic theologian and can't authentically speak on values, but I mean, values are things that people live by, people that sort of inform their behavior, inform their future orientation. But I think there's values with encoded, I would say, within technology that it actually sort of enhances, that it actually promotes. And I think the market values we see is one of those. But then on the other end, I think technology also exposes our values. What we, as we engage with technology and use it and living this digital life, we actually also bring to the fore what we believe and who we are, what is our values. So I think the challenge is on justice is very big. I think in the previous revolutions, that was, we see it was not fairly distributed, the opportunities, the access, etc. And with the fourth industrial revolution, it's even bigger. Because of the sophisticatedness of technology and the continuous forceful, it's not like it's slightly, it's actually very forceful in terms of how it's developing. We can't take for granted, and we need to sort of reflect on how we can make this world a more just world to live in. If technology is so sort of enhance so many things, why do we still have so many injustices? That's a big question for me. And we can end up with ethical dilemmas that been unknown to the human race. If you think about things like transhumanism and posthumanism, there's a lot to say. I mean, that's a topic on its own. But what for me, the question would be, where do you sort of make a line in the sand to say, where do you cross the line between transhumanism and posthumanism? A simplistic understanding of transhumanism is to say that we want to enhance life. So we all go for betterment. I mean, I won't be able to see on this PowerPoint if I don't have my spectacles on. And so it enhances my life. It makes it possible for me to be a lecturer, to be a researcher. But where does this go over to being beyond human? And I think we need to sort of, this transition here is a big moment of reflection that we really need to understand where do we sort of, because some of the things we really need, and it's really wonderful and great, but where do we sort of cross the line, I would say, in terms of being co-creators and not creators of life? Then, I mean, it's obvious human agency is really negatively affected, but it can also be enhanced. But I think if we think about in South Africa, the unemployment statistics came out not so long ago, and it's really shocking. And one of the things that's been said even by the proponents of technology in the digital age is that unemployment in certain areas will just grow. And then I'm sure you know about Harare, the historian that talks about those three books that he has written, and he talks about the agenda that human has because of this technology advantage is to say that we want to be happy and we want to be immortal, and that actually makes us kind of small gods in a sense. So how do we sort of, and that's why I'm referring to, where do we cross the line between transhumanism and posthumanism? I think how we can sort of engage with these, we need to sort of make sure there's people trained with knowledge of both technology and ethics. Now, I'm a Christian, so that gives me a certain view of ethics, and which is also limited. But in the broader world, I think there's basic values that people share. But if these two don't come together, I think we would really have problems in the future, big problems. So I think in our trainings where we train people, I think we need to bring these two together, and we have to take our responsibility. I think, like Johanna said, we can't sit back and see where the world is going and not make an effort to understand what is happening. Because we are actually, by using technology, we are actually co-creating this world. It's not only people that create technology that creates it, it's us using it co-creating the world. So we have to do research, I think, as churches. Therefore, I think I really want to applaud you for hosting this with institutions like universities and others that do research on this issue. And then, of course, for me, intergenerational conversations will be key. Remember, if we look at generations being born in a certain era and that's been influenced by certain things, young people are actually the people that's been born in a digital age, many of them. That's all they know. And it will be good to tap in on their view, how they see this, etc., and also their skills in terms of this. So yes, I think most probably my time is gone, so I will not go to the last slide. So yeah, the last slide is just a few questions that I pose in terms of how can we go forth in terms of theology reflecting on this. So that is all from my side, and thank you again for the wonderful opportunity.
Thank you, Professor Anita Klute. I think that especially in this dialogue between technology and ethics, church and religious organizations can play a key role and try to build bridges. So I'm very happy that you brought up that point. Also, when it comes to other sorts of dialogue, I think this is why we're here. I would like to invite you again to ask your questions in the chat, both here on Zoom, but also on YouTube. The team is monitoring it constantly and is sending me everything that I should ask you. And I would like to start with the first question to Marcelo. It says, as the challenge is strongly related to questions around the free will, where would you see the role of churches?
Perfecto, muchas gracias por la pregunta. Continúo hablando en español, ¿verdad?
I will continue speaking in Spanish. I believe that the role of churches has to do with what Diana and Professor Anita were saying, and something I also mentioned in my last point, which is that the church, on the one hand, is creating advocacy processes with specialists on the one hand, with technological and theological reflection, promoting policies that has to do with the control of these algorithms, or even with the creation of regulation in which human rights violations are not allowed, or that an algorithm could determine issues such as what we want to do in the next step. But it's not just about prediction, it is also about how our data are used to shape the way we think and we feel. And since I'm not a specialist in technological matters, I am more focused on political analysis at the international and local level. I see the manipulation of people in moments where people in the pandemics, for instance, had a lot of economical hardships, and these people were manipulated through the use of these preferences at the digital level and trying to touch into the emotions of people on the basis of the information of these platforms have of people. I am not saying that this is just a matter of manipulation, but it has been shown that this prediction of our preferences could lead to other political parties, for instance, or maybe an ideological apparatus to try to change our political positions, for instance. I believe that free will is something more radical, but we should also consider this. And to sum up, I believe that faith-based organizations have the role to reflect and also to collaborate with technological professionals in a way that we can allow the access of all people to these technologies, but also to the emancipation of humanity. Thank you.
Thank you a lot, Marcelo. I think that emancipation aspect is quite important and to reflect. And I think, if I understood you correctly, church and religious organizations in general can be that meeting point where that discussion is happening. The next question is addressed to Anita, and that person was asking, in how far can the challenges we do face and that you described be helpful for interfaith and reconciliation work?
Sure, that's an interesting question. Yes, I think interfaith, cross-culturally, etc., this is a very good meeting point in terms of trying to navigate our way as faith community through this world. I think like the last slide that I didn't show or didn't talk to now is exactly that, how our theological frameworks almost seems like it's inadequate today in terms of the challenges that we are facing. Sometimes we don't even know what the challenges are because we're not, like Marcelo said, most of us are not trained in terms of technology as such, but we try to reflect on it because we realize we have a responsibility. Yeah, I think when people come together and when people talk and where they have a common concern or they have something common to celebrate, I think that can bring, can cross bridges much deeper than just the issue that they're trying to address. So it could be potentially something that could assist in terms of reconciliation and also living with diversity, because people from different faiths can also have different perspectives and we can actually learn from each other. So I think that would be my response to that question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So again, we have interfaith work as a meeting point. Maybe that's quite interesting outcomes here and things that can also help us to look a bit into the future. Tiana, can I just put that question also to you, because you also mentioned in your presentation that churches and institutions have to take an active role. Would you also see that meeting point aspect as crucial and as key?
Thank you. What I actually really believe is that when we are considering just like churches or organizations, we are forgetting that churches are just living organisms. They are constitutes from people who are going into church. Therefore, people are like our seal, our target, and they should be like people who are bringing new ideas. And we cannot just expect from one church to give something that is not actually really already discussed within the believers there. That is not only for churches, it's for every single religion. Therefore, like when we are having people who are bringing together and having and sharing different ideas, that is on different level as it would be only between organizations. When you are having really like contact like we are having now, or even better, like without online screens, just to share some days with other religions and other people with different backgrounds, then we are having a feeling that we are really getting closer to each other, learning more, as Anita said, and it would be, I think, very fruitful for the future dialogues.
Thank you so much for sharing that. We do also have received some comments in the chat that I would like to read to you, and then maybe you can just raise your hand if you would like to comment on that. Critical mass is the huge barrier. I've seen a number of platforms try to start as alternatives to Facebook, even from organizations like Google. Remember Google+? that just couldn't build enough of a critical mass to be effective. I think it's easier for peer-to-peer messengers than it is for wider platforms. But even new platforms like TikTok either get bought up or end up being either own massive organizations with questionable politics and motives. Would one of you like to comment on that? I think it was written while Marcelo was speaking, when you were speaking about the monopoles and how to look for a plan B and to not just simply accept everything, but to do some emancipation processes as well.
Estoy leyendo la pregunta nuevamente.
I am reading the question again. I do not have neither a negative or a positive opinion regarding these platforms. I believe that ultimately the business plan that I was mentioning from these platforms that we can reduce to Google, Amazon, Facebook, and maybe some more that are the ones with the biggest share, are the ones that are going to devour the rest of the industry. And this is a big problem because this has great repercussions, not just in terms of services, in providing better services, because I think that this arena could make us more like a product. But finally, these monopolies, I believe, generate a control that goes beyond governments. It's a way of having also the monopoly of decision-making at the global level. If we believe this can be changed, I don't know, but one of the main issues and concerns that we should consider is that users that pay for information in these platforms are also big corporations, and they are not interested at all in democracy in many cases as a means for economic development. They realize that even in authoritarian regimes or even in destabilization processes, the products they offer or the shares they have in different companies, etc., can continue to grow, even if there is no democracy present. And for me, that's the greatest danger, the accumulation of power of these great big platforms that are also transnational. And the clients of these big corporations that are not even interested in regulating themselves or in democratic processes. I remember when there was a coup d'etat in Bolivia, and many companies there, especially the ones related with lithium mining, were really happy about this coup. So it looks like democracy is not something they consider at all, and it's not as a precondition for big corporations or for digital technologies that are mere intermediaries in this process. Maybe that it would be my reflection on this subject, the accumulation of information and power, and on the other hand, corporations that can develop themselves and continue to grow without considering any regulations or working in an environment of democracy.
Thank you. Thank you, Marcelo. I would like to hand over to Anita, because you also mentioned you called it an ethical dilemma. and that values need to be identified. And I think that tackles that question or that comment a lot as well.
Okay, I think I forgot the question now after Marcel's response, but I think it's, yeah, I think the dilemmas is that there's things developing that we still try to understand, and that will bring us between, I mean, a dilemma is something, there's not easy answer to that, right? So sometimes I remember one of the things that I remember from my undergrad ethical classes was sometimes you have to choose between, almost like between two evils. Maybe evil is not the best word, but I mean, sometimes there's not this unique Christian way of thinking that we think for all these things we will have a perfect answer and we will grab a text. I'm just seeing in the chat also something that I found interesting and is very important is the whole fear, apocalyptic fears, and people saying this is the end times. This virus means that we sort of, and how we actually are revealed as church in this pandemic in terms of the things that we've learned, our members, how they interpret the Bible, how they sort of just refuse to accept that there's no simplistic answers, even from a Christian perspective. So that many refuse to accept this as a, firstly, as a health issue, as a scientific thing that we need to understand that way. But but I think people are also overwhelmed. So they want to have some kind of answer, and that they try to create this answer. So I think one must also read people's responses against a lot of different backgrounds, not just to say they want to sort of remember from their point of view that is their truth in the moment that they're living in. This is their truth too. They don't even think it's about making people fearful. Maybe there are people that think that's what they want to achieve, but others just think they are doing what is right in this context. So, but I think in South Africa, I've come across a lot of this very simplistic ideas of how using the Bible. And I was just wondering, after everything, after so many years of doing theology and having people that are trained in churches, do people still have the simplistic idea of the world, about God, and even about the Bible? That they can reduce answers like this or situations to this easy kind of answers. So yeah, that will, in terms of our free will, I'm not sure. Technology promises us actually freedom, greater freedom than what we have, right? If we sort of follow or agree to what Harare, for instance, are arguing for. But I think the opposite is actually happening at the same time. As we are manipulated and as we are reduced to data, etc., etc. So that is a difficult, and that is a kind of a dilemma that we are in. We can't ignore these things. It's happening with us. It's happening by us. So yeah, we actually trying to figure out ways to shore while we're swimming in sometimes drowning. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Anita. That was really interesting. I would like to come back to one of the questions that you raised in your presentation, but before asking you for your opinion, I wanted to ask it to Tiana. The question is, are we open for a critique of our technological frameworks by these technological developments? And I think it goes together a bit with another question that was raised to you, Tiana, how our active role can be and how far we should go.
On the first question should be yes answer. And I really believe that active role is something that is definitely necessary. What also now Anita said, that we are probably sometimes taking technology very naive, like giving to kids without any kind of knowledge as a parents first, like to use something. There was a really good documentary about social media and stuff, and then one of the richest men in the world, like when Bill Gates said he's not allowing his kids to use the social networks until they are like 14 years old, and because exactly of the kind of impact the technologies have on kids' brains and how it's actually how it's have an impact on their development. It's very important. And we are sometimes just like taking everything what we have in our hands and using that all the time. Technology is not something that is like from 10 years. Like we have technology since the beginning of the world. So it was just different development that was helping people. Like the idea of technology is to help. From the beginning on, it was first like tools to have a possibility to do some agriculture. That is also technology at that point. Like we are saying now about transhumanism and about enhancement. Like enhancement is also using like possibility to use glasses and to see better. So there is also different waves and stages of technology. Now, the thing is that who is using the technology? That's we are using. We are human beings. We have, as also Marcelo said, like free will, possibility to rationalize in our heads and to say what it should be and what is actually useful for us as a human beings. Of course, that we should not go into that river thinking that technological companies, they're huge and they're using us as products. What also Marcelo in his speech said, that they're wanting something best for us. That is probably the worst way to comprehend technology. Like we have possibility to use it on a good way. It is not something that is bad or good. It is our judgment and our usage is just making it good or bad for us and for the society. So I believe that should be very, very important to say that. I think that also Anita said like a few times she mentioned also historian like Yuval Harari, and I agree that it is idea to give us freedom, but also what is freedom for all of us? What should be freedom of? Do we have freedom of choice, or is it just like freedom where we have choices between different options? Thank you.
Anita, it's your turn. What do you think?
Can you just, what was your question again?
The question. It was your own question. The question was how open we are to critique of our technical frameworks by the technical development.
About the theological frameworks, right? Yeah, I'm not sure that we even think that that is what is happening. I mean, I know I've done an article on film and also the book that I've recently done on how that actually create a world of meaning making, and how does it actually, and how does religion then actually sort of engage with that people come with their own religious views to that, and how. But I'm not sure if we in our classical traditional churches are actually open to the challenges that technology is actually posing to us. If I, because I, for instance, asked the question, how do we celebrate human labor or human creativity, and how do we critique it? Where do we draw the line? So that is the whole idea of dilemmas, and where do we sort of draw the line in terms of these things? Because many of these things that are developed, if we just think about the scientific knowledge and work that's been done in terms of medical through technology, it's really mind-boggling, right? We can't actually comprehend it because we're not medical people, but we're just reading it and seeing videos about it. It's actually so great. But that's a question, where does it sort of spill over into something more than when does it make it more than goes to posthumanism? I'm just using that phrases because it's actually recognized phrases in the academic world in reflecting on this. So yes, we want to enhance, and there's no quick answer to that. We need to sort of for ourselves figure that out and talk about these things with the Bible, with our theological. We need to revisit our theological frameworks, I think, and especially focusing on ethics. Because many of the things that we now referring to, many people on ground level will never think about, right? So there's a big play in on class also in technology, right? The man that's now doing is building the street there as I come out from my house, he's not thinking about these things, but it affects him in a certain way. It actually excludes him more. It will keep him on that, making that tar road the rest of his life. While two of us can now talk in this way and actually have this elite privilege of talking about things that many people will never cross people's minds. So, and that makes our responsibility even bigger. How do we go there What do we do with this information? How does it filter through to the men on the street? And how do we impact with our message in terms of where we're living? Yeah, so thank you. That would be my response. But I can just say I'm really very impressed with the World Council of Churches doing this at a stage like this. Very important.
Thank you, Anita. Thank you so much. And I think this discussion is indeed very important and very good that we have it. I have one very last question going to Marcelo. The transformation of the digital space by some, the other one. How can we struggle against the hegemony of global platforms when de facto we use their very tools to network and organize? Open access tools may offer a possibility, but don't always have the necessary critical mass.
Es una gran pregunta.
This is a very big question and a good question indeed. So I would try to say it in an easy way. So even if we are critical of our own systems, we are forced to live inside these systems. I mean, we could, of course, survive without social media and all those tools, which are really good for working. But my point is that the idea is not advocating for the destruction of this social media, but maybe people working in cybersecurity and open source applications may give much more comprehensive replies and answers, solutions to create better tools for navigation and for taking care of the privacy of our personal data. It is a private and specific language that we can also learn, because this is a language that is open for learning. So seeing how we manage our cookies, whether we accept them or not, how we use and our data are used online. And we should be careful every time we download an application, for instance, because sometimes we do not read the terms of reference and we just automatically accept these terms, and we become unaware that by doing that, we are giving away a lot of personal information. So it is not a question of taking part or not taking part in this technological revolution. We just need to understand which ways are there for us to reduce damages. So to say, of course, it could be better to go towards open source applications, free software, and maybe engineers could explain this much better. And see how these dynamics of fighting against hegemony and corporation against other kind of organizations. But we have to think that when we buy such applications for our churches, universities, etc., we are reclaiming this hegemony. But if we intended for a stronger activism, we would try to collectively go forward towards free software systems instead of paying for Microsoft or Apple systems. So there are different ways to do this, but I do believe that our fight here is regarding to counter narratives and regulations. If we can't escape, and we necessarily shouldn't escape the use of these technologies, then we need regulations. We need to regulate them and legislate on monopolies. This is what we should be doing, because we will be needing to use these tools in the current society, and we need to create associations and coalitions with civil society who have been working on these issues for much longer. So creating this link with many organizations, many civil society organizations who have been working a long way on these issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcelo. I would like to hand over to Anita, who has her hand up on purpose. Maybe not.
Sorry, no, I think maybe I didn't take it off. No, I don't have my hand up again, sorry.
Perfect. That's perfect, because then we are perfectly in time to close this session and this discussion. I want to thank you so much, Tiana, Anita, and Marcelo, for bringing your perspectives and for raising so many issues. I think the future will be full of work. There's going to be a lot of things to discuss and to do. It's going to be very interesting, very challenging, but I'm hopeful. Thank you for being with us today. Now I would like to hand over again from Berlin to Berlin. We have another word of greeting. We have Silke Lechner with us, who is the deputy head of the Division for Religion and Foreign Policy at the Federal Foreign Office. And we are kind of your guests today.
Yes, thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be with you and to join in your discussions. While currently I'm working for the Division Religion and Foreign Policy, I have a background in the ecumenical movement. I used to work for the German Protestant Kirchentag, and I was involved in the international ecumenical world. And because of that background, I'm especially delighted to be with you here in this session. A few weeks ago, a colleague from ENW told me that during this past year, we have come closer to our partners because we realized we don't have to wait for the next face-to-face meeting. We realized we can communicate in between. And I thought that was a wonderful thing to share. And I think it's an experience we probably all made, and I think it's also a huge discovery and potential for the World Council of Churches and its network. Although this kind of communication never replaces a face-to-face meeting, it's an additional form of communication that we have and that we should increasingly use in the future. One thing you discussed this morning was critical mass and what can be done. And one comment I have on this is that I think don't underestimate your potential that you have. The World Council of Churches has 350 churches in well over 100 countries with all its individual members. So you have potential to bring in your ethical standards and to share and to shape how things are run in this context. And I encourage you to do so. We as the German Federal Foreign Office believe in the power of civil society actors. And within this group, faith-based actors play an important role. They play an important role in many countries around this world. They have the trust of their societies. They engage for social justice. So they are excellent partners. They are foreign policy actors. And we are happy, for that reason, to work together with the World Council of Churches. We are happy that we can support this conference here, but also the other activities that you have this year as you work towards your important assembly, which you will have in Karlsruhe next year, and we are proud and happy that this assembly will be in Germany for the first time, and we're happy that we can support this, but we are also happy that we can be part of these discussions and learn from you. Thank you, and I hope you will have good discussions in the next sessions and during this conference. Thank you.
There's applause in the room. I don't know if you hear that, but we have people in Berlin at the symposium in the same room, so they were able to not just do the applause on Zoom, but applause that you could hear, at least here in Berlin. Thank you so much, Silke, for your words. I think quite important, and I'm very happy that you would agree with me when I say that tomorrow starts today, and that we can shape our future, and that we have potential, and that we just have to use it. I do invite everybody to think about ways to use our potential over lunch, or breakfast, or dinner, or coffee, or whatever you can eat or drink during the break, because we will take a break now, and we will be back at 1 p.m. Central European Summer Time. See you later.